Hello YouTube. In this video we're going to look at an argument against nihilism proposed by Guy Kahane in his article If Nothing Matters. It's a kind of wager argument analogous to Pascal's wager for the existence of God. Kahane is going to argue that there are good pragmatic reasons to believe that nihilism is false. So the first question is, what is nihilism? Well, nihilism is a term that has many uses in philosophy, but as Kahane defines it, nihilism is the view that nothing matters. Nothing is good or bad, nothing deserves our attention or concern. More precisely, Kahane distinguishes two related views. First, there is evaluative nihilism, which says that all evaluative propositions are false. There are no values. Nothing is good or bad. Nothing is valuable or disvaluable. Nothing is better or worse than anything else. So suffering is bad. That's false. Peace is better than genocide. That's false. True beliefs are valuable. That's false, and so on. Second, there is practical nihilism, which says that there are no reasons to do, want, or feel anything. There is no reason to protest against injustice, no reason to seek the truth, no reason to avoid pain or suffering. Evaluative nihilism is often thought to lead to practical nihilism, because if nothing is good or bad, if nothing is better or worse than anything else, then it seems we would have no reason to prefer one outcome to another. So the thought might be that reasons have their source in value. Of course, some philosophers deny that there's any necessary connection between reasons and values, so we might treat these two views as being separate. Still, I mean, the point is that both evaluative nihilism and practical nihilism are both expressions of this basic idea that nothing matters. And so Kahane's argument is going to apply to both. So in this video we will take nihilism to refer to evaluative nihilism and practical nihilism. Okay, quick advert. If you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon. There will be extra content being uploaded on there about all of the videos that I'm going to make from this point forward. You can join the Discord if you want to talk about any of this stuff, and I offer private tutoring. Email if you are interested in that. Okay then, so we've just explained what nihilism is. There are no values or reasons. Now you might wonder, okay, well, why would anyone take this sort of view seriously in the first place? Actually, it is a view that is taken seriously by a lot of people. Here is one standard argument for nihilism. Here's how Kahane puts it. Premise 1, nothing matters objectively. Premise 2, for something to matter is for it to matter objectively. So, conclusion, nothing matters. Both premises 1 and 2 have been defended in contemporary philosophy. Both of these premises are taken seriously. So most anti-realists about value will accept premise 1 and deny premise 2. So the anti-realist will say, yeah, nothing matters objectively, but still plenty of things matter. They don't have to matter objectively in order to matter. So according to non-cognitivists, for instance, some things matter. It's just that our judgments about what matters are merely expressions of our attitudes of approval and disapproval. So to say that slavery is wrong is to express a negative attitude towards slavery, and it's to be prepared to blame those who enslave others and to feel sympathy for those enslaved. That's what it is for slavery to be wrong, right? So slavery matters to us, and that's all it takes for something to matter. But the anti-realist will accept, yeah, that nothing matters objectively. Premise 1 is true. On the other hand, take realists. So particularly non-naturalist realists, they will tend to accept premise 2. They will tend to say, yeah, for something to matter is for it to matter objectively, but they'll deny premise 1. So they will say, when we make judgments about what's good or bad, or about what we have reason to do, this involves an implicit commitment to objective values or objective reasons. And luckily, there are such objective values and reasons. So things matter, and for things to matter is for them to matter objectively. That's what a lot of people on the realist side will say. They will accept premise 1 here, they will accept premise 2, but deny premise 1. So the important point is both premise 1 and premise 2 of this argument are taken seriously. And moreover, there are some philosophers who will accept both premises and then draw the nihilist conclusion. There are the error theorists, people like J.L. Mackie. So according to error theorists, when I make judgments like murder is wrong or you ought not to enslave people, these judgments do presuppose objective values, just as premise 2 says. But also, there are no objective values, just as premise 1 says. So all such judgments are false. I have a whole series on metaethics if you're interested in learning more about this. Anyway, the point is, here we have an argument for nihilism. That's just one argument for nihilism. It's not the only one you might give, but it's it's a very simple one, and it's probably the one that's most influential in contemporary philosophy. So this is why we might take it seriously. So, okay, it's something we have to take seriously. Kahane presents a wager against nihilism. So, he says, when we inquire into whether nihilism is true, there are 4 possibilities. So, number 1 is that nothing matters, but I believe that some things do matter. So I have the false belief that some things matter. Possibility number 2 is that nothing matters, and I believe that nothing matters. Number 3, some things matter, and I believe that some things matter. So I correctly believe that some things matter. Possibility number 4, some things matter, and I incorrectly believe that nothing matters. Okay then, we can now ask, all right, well, what's the value of each outcome? Which should we kind of prefer? Not just in terms of which is correct, but just in general. So, possibilities 1 and 2 are irrelevant either way. If nothing matters, it doesn't matter whether I believe that things matter. If nothing is good or bad, neither believing nihilism nor disbelieving nihilism could be good or bad. Now, of course, you might say, well, even if nothing matters, I still want to have true beliefs. I desire true beliefs. So I would prefer to believe nihilism if nihilism is true. That's fine. But if nihilism is true, nothing matters. So your concerns and preferences don't matter. So the point is, possibilities 1 and 2, they just don't matter. Okay, so we can move on from them. Now, of course, some people will respond to the idea of nihilism with despair. They will see nihilism as a very bad option. But Kahane argues that's a mistake, right? If nothing matters, it can't matter that nothing matters. It can't make things bad or worse because there are no evaluative properties. If nothing matters, there are no reasons to respond to this in one way rather than another. So it can't be said that, if nothing matters, there is reason for despair. If nothing matters, there's no reason for anything. So that's possibilities 1 and 2. We'll now consider possibility number 3. Some things matter, and I believe that some things matter. Well, that would be good. Or at least it creates the possibility for much good. It's good for me to recognise what's good and to try to promote it. It's good for me to recognise my reasons for believing and my reasons for acting and to respond appropriately to those reasons. So possibility number 3 would be good. What about case 4? Well, alright, case 4. Some things matter, and I believe that nothing matters. So suppose that there really are values and reasons, but I do not believe that there are values or reasons. Now this, Kahane thinks, could be very harmful. We'll consider his arguments in more detail shortly, but the basic idea is that if we came to believe that nihilism is true, we would likely lose many of our subjective concerns. So the false belief in nihilism may be bad in itself because, if you reject nihilism, you're presumably going to think that the truth matters, so false beliefs are other things being equal bad. But worse, Kahane thinks, if we came to believe in nihilism, we would likely begin to think and act in ways that are morally and prudentially harmful. And again, we'll consider his arguments shortly. So 4 could be disastrous. Possibilities number 1 and 2, irrelevant because nothing matters. Possibility 3 would probably be good. Possibility 4 would be disastrous. And so hopefully you can start to see the shape of this basic wager against nihilism. The idea is, if nihilism is true, we gain nothing by believing that it's true, and we lose nothing by believing that it's false. By contrast, if nihilism is false, then we stand to lose a lot by believing that it's true. And perhaps we stand to gain something by believing that it's false. So the thought is, we can't be harmed by failing to believe in nihilism. We can be harmed by believing nihilism. Nihilism in itself is nothing to fear, because if nihilism is true, nothing matters. So obviously there's nothing to fear. But mistaken belief in nihilism is something to fear, because if things matter and we believe that nothing matters, then this could have disastrous consequences for us. So, Kahane says, there are pragmatic reasons to resist belief in nihilism, pragmatic reasons to believe that things matter. Now, obviously, if nihilism is true, there are no such pragmatic reasons, because there are no reasons for anything. So this wager can be pitched only at people who do not currently accept nihilism. It's obviously not going to work against people who are already committed to nihilism. But, you know, I mean, there's a lot of people who are not nihilists, but who perhaps find themselves tempted by the arguments. Here is a pragmatic reason to resist those arguments. All right, so the claim is that that believing that nihilism is true could have negative consequences. Why? What exactly is the harm of believing nihilism? So we have to distinguish the normative question of how we ought to respond to nihilism from the causal question of how, in fact, we would respond to nihilism, were we to believe it. The causal question is a question about our actual psychological dispositions. If we came to believe in nihilism, what would happen? And for Kahane, that is the relevant question. So if you believe that nihilism is true, that can't give you normative reasons to think or do anything. So the belief that nihilism is true, if you just ask, well, what should follow from that, the answer is nothing. But the point is that believing that nihilism is true might well have a significant causal influence on us, and that causal influence could be negative. So, on the one hand then, there is the no difference view. According to the no difference view, coming to believe in nihilism would make no difference, or at least it would make relatively little difference. If we came to believe nihilism, pretty much everything would go on as before. Why? Well, because even though nothing matters, even though we believe that nothing matters, we would still have the same concerns, hopes, dreams, desires. Nothing matters, but we might say, yeah, but things still matter to us. Or at least we can still think and act as if things matter. So the basic idea is this. If nothing matters, we certainly wouldn't have any reason to change our desires, because we wouldn't have any reason to do anything. You know, a person who comes to believe that nothing matters and then responds to this by giving up all of their desires and interests, that person is confused. If you clear away that confusion, you can see that belief in nihilism is toothless. So think about our moral judgments. The nihilist says there is nothing that we morally ought or ought not to do. But that doesn't stop us from making moral judgments. So I have a video called Moral Error Theory, Now What?, which gives a summary of different responses to the idea that there is nothing we morally ought or ought not to do. But okay, one view is, well, we can treat moral discourse as a kind of useful fiction. Okay, so we want to live in a society that is stable, peaceful, and so on. We want people to follow particular rules for behaviour so that people can cooperate with each other and promote each other's flourishing. And we might think that moral judgment is an effective means of encouraging this. When we pass moral judgments about people's behaviour, when we praise people for certain things that they do or blame them for certain things that they do, that has the effect of helping to regulate their behaviour. So because we want a society that is peaceful and cooperative, and because we think that morality is a means of achieving this, we will continue to make moral judgments, even though all moral judgments are false. Now, obviously, from the point of view of nihilism, we're not going to be able to cash out the idea that moral discourse is, when we say it's useful, that's not going to be, it's not useful in terms of objective reasons or values. Perhaps the most that can be said is that, we have particular desires. Moral discourse is an effective means of achieving these desires. So if nihilism is true, there is no reason to do what would satisfy your desires. But really, all we need to say here is that, well, just as a psychological fact, people generally do try to satisfy their desires, and believing nihilism isn't going to make any difference to that. So we have the desire for a peaceful, cooperative society. We recognise that moral discourse helps promote this, so we use moral discourse. All right, that's the no difference view. Okay, once we come to believe that nihilism is true, we will indeed come to believe that there's no reason to retain our subjective concerns. There's no reason to try to satisfy those concerns, but there's also no reason not to do those things, and as it happens, our subjective concerns would remain unchanged. The belief that nothing matters doesn't change my desires, so it's not really going to make that much difference to anything. According to the difference view, by contrast, coming to believe nihilism will significantly affect our subjective concerns. And Kahane is going to try to defend the difference view. Kahane thinks that belief in nihilism would make a difference. So most people, before they think about philosophy, and before they come to philosophy and start engaging with arguments for nihilism, they have various beliefs about what's good or bad. They have various beliefs about what they have reason to do. So, I might believe that suffering is bad, or I might believe that I have reason to be concerned for my own future. Now, if I come to believe nihilism, then I will come to believe that it is false that suffering is bad. Or I will come to believe that it is false that I have reason to be concerned about my long-term future. I mean, this is just what it is to be a nihilist, right? If you're a nihilist, you believe the falsity of these normative claims. That's just what nihilism is. So, Kahane says, there is a principle he labels belief loss. Belief loss says, coming to believe nihilism will result in losing our evaluative beliefs. And, that does seem to be what nihilism involves. Kahane draws an analogy to witches. So let's say that, I believe that there are witches, but then you convince me that there are no witches. Well, in that case, you would expect me to revise various beliefs that I had about witches. So if I believed before that Delia was a witch, you would expect me to revise that belief. You would expect me to say now, oh, well, yeah, of course, Delia's not a witch, because there are no witches. If I just carried on as I did before, if I continued to say that Delia was a witch, and I continued to explain various phenomena as the result of Delia's witchcraft, you would just think that you failed to persuade me that there are no witches. Or at least you would think that I'm confused about my commitments. So, in the same way, if I believe that nothing matters, then I'm going to believe that suffering doesn't matter. I'm going to believe that my own future doesn't matter. Unless, of course, I'm just confused. Okay, so next, Kahane proposes what he says is just a truism. So we can call this the principle of covariance, which says that our subjective concerns tend to co-vary with our evaluative beliefs. So the idea is, look, people tend to seek out what they believe is valuable. They tend to avoid what they believe is disvaluable. They tend to ignore what they believe is of no value either way. In general, if a person believes that something is valuable and they care about it for that reason, and then they revise their beliefs so that they take it to have no value, they're going to stop caring about it. Now, Kahane grants that there's no necessary connection here, that there doesn't have to be a necessary connection between evaluative belief and subjective concern. So it is possible, Kahane grants, to be concerned about what you believe has no value. And it's possible to be unconcerned about what you believe does have value. But he says, even so, I mean, while this may be possible, there's still clearly a close correlation, right? It seems to be the case that, just as a matter of psychological fact, our evaluative beliefs will like lead to or will cause us to have particular subjective concerns. For example, Kahane says, suppose that Sydney spends a lot of time bird watching, but then he comes to believe that bird watching is of no value at all. It's pointless, worthless, meaningless. He has no reason to bother bird watching. Well, you'd expect that Sydney would stop caring about bird watching. Or suppose that Verity is a meat eater. Verity doesn't care about animals. But then she reads Animal Liberation and she comes to believe that animal welfare matters and that killing animals for food is wrong. Well, we would expect that in that case, Verity is going to care somewhat about animal suffering and feel some motivation to stop eating meat. Now, of course, there's no guarantee that she's going to stop eating meat. Maybe she just really enjoys the taste of meat. Maybe she's too lazy to figure out a vegan diet. And, anyway, it's easy to ignore the killing when you're just purchasing meat at a supermarket. I'm not seeing the animals suffer, so, it's easy to put it out of your mind. But even in this case, Verity is still concerned about animal welfare to some degree, right? She doesn't act on her concern because she has other concerns or because she's sometimes able to compartmentalize and put the concern out of her mind. But there's still a concern there. There's still some motivation to change her behavior. It would be very unusual for somebody to judge that animal welfare matters, right? So if for me to believe that, that animal welfare matters and that we ought not to eat animals, it would be odd to hold that belief, but then just have no concern about animals whatsoever. Or suppose that Warris is an egoist. He believes that only he matters, other people don't matter at all. He believes he ought to act only in his own self-interest. But then he opens up Parfit's Reasons and Persons, and as a result he comes to believe that egoism is actually irrational and mistaken, and other people matter as well. We ought to promote everybody's own well-being, not just our own. Well, again, we would expect that this would transform what Warris cares about. So whereas before he only cared about himself, now he cares about others. That's what we would expect. At least, that's Kahane's view, I think. So the point is that changing our evaluative beliefs can transform what we care about. Kahane takes this to be a truism about evaluative belief. And these sorts of cases are illustrative of that. Now, there is, of course, a further question about why exactly this covariance holds. Why does changing evaluative belief lead to change in subjective concern? Well, Kahane doesn't take any particular position on this, and he doesn't need to for his argument. All that's required is that there is this relationship. So, here's the basic summary of the argument. Premise 1. For the no difference view to be correct, our subjective concerns must survive belief in nihilism. Premise 2. Belief loss. Coming to believe in nihilism will result in losing our evaluative beliefs, because coming to believe in nihilism involves coming to believe that all our evaluative beliefs are false. So if I think that those beliefs are false, I'm going to lose them. Premise 3. Covariance. Our subjective concerns co-vary closely with our evaluative beliefs. When we come to believe that something is worthless, normally the result is that we stop caring about that thing. Premise 4. So, if we come to believe nihilism, probably we will stop caring about many of the things we currently care about. And so the conclusion is, the no difference view is probably false. Belief in nihilism probably would make a significant causal difference to our concerns, our subjective concerns. Now, it does not follow from this that all subjective concerns would fade away. Kahane doesn't say that. He says, yeah, so there may well remain, so as he puts it, mere animal striving. So if you look at other animals, they presumably do not have evaluative beliefs, at least not in the sense that we do. But animals have concerns, their lives do not come to a standstill. There are all sorts of things that animals will seek out and avoid. Human beings have animal drives, as it were. We try to avoid pain, we eat when we're hungry, we drink when we're thirsty, we seek out companionship with others, things like that. But so, okay, we're probably going to continue to be motivated in that sense, right? We'll be driven by whatever passing desires arise from our basic biology. But Kahane thinks if we became nihilists, we probably would lose our commitment to long-term projects and to moral ideals and things like that. So, I've spent many years of my life doing philosophy, sometimes, hours and hours every day. And philosophy is a very unusual activity. It takes a lot of effort and it's often frustrating. And part of the reason why I'm doing it, I suppose, is because I'm expecting there to be some longer term payoff. If I came to believe that philosophy is worthless, that there's no reason at all to do it, if I came to believe that my own future just doesn't really matter, well, why would I continue to care about doing philosophy? I mean, why would I bother spending the time grinding away, trying to read and write things that are trying to figure out difficult arguments and so on. Why would I do that? So I'm not going to do that. I might as well just sit and stuff chocolate cake into my face. So again, Kahane doesn't claim that it's impossible that I would continue to care about philosophy, just that it's unlikely, right? Once I believe that philosophy is pointless, I'm probably going to stop doing it. So the conclusion is that belief in nihilism, the belief that nothing matters, will cause us to lose many of our subjective concerns. It's not that nihilism... So, again, this isn't a normative claim. We're not saying, well, if nihilism is true, you ought not to care about anything. Of course not, because there are no normative facts if nihilism is true. But it's just a causal claim. Psychologically, this is what would happen. If we came to believe in nihilism, that would probably lead us to lose our subjective concerns. And so, with that said, we can revisit Kahane's wager. Possibilities 1 and 2, right? They're irrelevant. If nothing matters, then it doesn't matter what I believe. The crucial case here is the fourth possibility. So, some things matter, and I believe that nothing matters. That, Kahane thinks, could be disastrous. Coming to believe nihilism would lead me to lose many of my subjective concerns. I would no longer be responsive to values and reasons, and so I would probably begin to think and act in ways that are morally and prudentially harmful, because I would no longer, I would no longer be responsive to, the fact that, say, suffering in general is bad. When the fact that other people are suffering, well, maybe it would move me, maybe it wouldn't, but certainly I'm probably not going to be, I wouldn't have some long-term commitment to reducing suffering in the world. Maybe if I see someone suffering in front of me, it might move me, but again, a moral ideal that I'm committed to, probably not. Or similarly, my making long-term plans for the future, spending hours and hours a day doing philosophy because I want to gain knowledge, and this is a long-term project. Probably not going to do that anymore. So we would be impoverished. So that's a disaster, and this is why the belief in nihilism can be harmful, but believing that nihilism is false, rejecting nihilism, that can't be harmful, and so that's a good pragmatic reason to resist nihilism. Okay then, that's the wager. That's the argument against nihilism. Let's turn to some objections. Okay, a general objection to wager arguments like this is that belief isn't a matter of choice. So we might say, look, whether I believe that nihilism is true is just going to depend on my evaluation of the arguments for nihilism. And if I find those arguments convincing, I'm going to endorse nihilism, and that's that. I can't just choose to reject something if I think the arguments are convincing. So, yeah, I mean, you can argue that it would be good, to reject nihilism, but that's just irrelevant. I mean, so I might well think this. I might well think, as I'm evaluating these arguments for nihilism, I might think, it's going to be regrettable if I find these arguments convincing, or at least if I find these arguments convincing and I'm wrong about that, it's going to be regrettable. Because, of course, if nihilism is true, then nothing is regrettable. But, yeah, so if I find these arguments convincing and I'm wrong, that's going to be regrettable. But, sometimes regrettable things happen. And that's that. So, what might we say in response to this? Well, note that Kahane's wager is directed at people who are not nihilists. For the nihilist, nothing is good or bad and there are no reasons for anything, so obviously this wager is not going to provide the nihilist with any reason to change their minds. The point of the wager is to provide a practical reason for those of us who are not currently nihilists to continue resisting nihilism. And one obvious way to do this is just to refrain from engaging with the arguments for nihilism. If you find yourself being tempted by the arguments for nihilism, you have a practical reason to close the book and go and do something else. So yeah, we can grant that you can't choose what to believe directly, but you can choose what arguments you think about, and the arguments that you engage with can affect your beliefs. So yeah, if you find yourself being tempted by nihilism, you should stop doing philosophy and go and do something else. And you can choose to do that. So, a second objection. Kahane's argument rests on an empirical claim about human psychology. So it rests on this claim that changes in evaluative belief lead to changes in our subjective concerns. Now, Kahane doesn't actually give any empirical evidence in support of this. He says that this covariance claim is a truism. So he seems to think it's just obvious. Is it though? Is it really so obvious? Okay, so there's a couple of issues that we might take with this. Here's one concern. Are we sure, is it obvious, that evaluative belief and subjective concerns are distinct states in the first place? So, I mean, look, here's a worry, right? So it seems plausible that there are going to be some ordinary contexts where people use statements like, I care about preventing suffering, or I believe that suffering is bad, right? People can use these statements to express basically the same sentiments, the same views, the same intentions. Now, the point here is not to endorse non-cognitivism. I'm not saying that when a person makes the judgment that suffering is bad, this does nothing more than express an attitude of disapproval towards suffering. The idea is more, it might well be that there's just this host of very complex psychological states that people can have, so like, I can... It's not so. It may not be obvious that there are these like distinct psychological states of, belief and desire, right? There's all sorts of kind of inclinations, views, attitudes, feelings, right? All of there's this big mess of stuff, and then there's language that we can use to express these states, and again, language itself is also messy. So we have statements like I believe X, I care about X. And these statements can be used to express all sorts of these messy psychological states. So there's, the vision. So in other words, the picture that Kahane presents is where we have these distinct states: evaluative belief and subjective concern, and then we have judgments that express these distinct states. But it might just be that the whole thing is a lot more complex and messy and context dependent. One thing to bear in mind here is that when a person comes to hold the belief that nothing matters, this usually happens only after exposure to philosophical arguments. So I can engage with a philosophical argument, and these arguments explicitly draw a distinction between evaluative belief and subjective concern, right? So these arguments rest on this technical distinction. Now, once that technical distinction has been drawn, I can say, yeah, I reject that belief, and maybe I can reject that belief and retain the concern. Now, if in ordinary contexts you never saw any significant distinction between the evaluative belief and the subjective concern, you might well think, when you encounter such philosophical arguments, you might well think, well, really, I never had the evaluative belief in the first place. in the sense that these philosophers mean. So, the philosopher's evaluative belief that suffering matters may not be the same as the ordinary person's evaluative belief that suffering matters. For instance, a philosopher might say that the evaluative belief that suffering matters presupposes that there are objective, non-natural reasons for action, objective, non-natural reasons to avoid bringing about suffering, for instance. And I might say, well, yeah, I mean, in that sense, I do not believe that suffering matters. In that sense, nothing. My belief is that nothing matters. But also, in this sense, I never had the belief that suffering matters, and I might well be skeptical that other ordinary people have such a belief. So, my subjective concerns are not going to co-vary with my evaluative beliefs in this sense. I mean, that's just one suggestion. The important point is this. Kahane presupposes a covariance between evaluative belief and subjective concern, but it's not obvious that there's a clear way to, draw the distinction. So it's not obvious that there are, in fact, these two distinct states. And even if there are these two distinct states, it's actually not obvious what the relation is between them. I mean, the psychology of belief and desire is still controversial. It's still an open question, at least as far as I know. I'm not aware of any empirical studies establishing Kahane's covariance claim. But again, I'm not an expert in psychology, so I don't know. Maybe there is work on that out there, but that would be one concern. Okay, here's another worry. So Kahane's support for the covariance claim is based on what we might think of as everyday changes in evaluative belief, but the situation might be different during revolutionary shifts. So let me explain what I mean. A useful analogy here would be to consider the connection between religious belief and subjective concern. So a religious person, we can imagine a religious person defending these two claims. God belief loss, which says that coming to believe atheism will result in losing our beliefs about God's commands, and God covariance, which says our subjective concerns tend to co-vary with our beliefs about God's commands. Historically, it has been pretty common for religious people to worry that atheism will lead to immorality. And, they could make a similar argument to Kahane, because you can notice that in some religious communities, there are some specific cases where this covariance of beliefs about God's commands and subjective concerns seems to hold. So, Verity, let's say, is really concerned about avoiding pork. Why? Well, because it's prohibited by her religion. Verity believes that God has commanded people not to eat pork, and her subjective concerns are based on what she takes to be God's commands. So if Verity were to revise her religious belief, if she were to come to think that God actually instructs people to eat pork, well, she's going to change her concerns about pork. She's going to start to think, actually, I want to eat pork. So, on the basis of these sorts of cases, and considering how central religion is to the lives of many people, people in religious communities may come to think that all, or at least almost all, of their subjective concerns are dependent on their religious belief. And so, this leads to the worry that atheists are a bunch of immoral libertines. But in practice, when you give up a religion, you don't tend to give up all your subjective concerns, or even most of them. So when a person abandons a religion, they tend to retain most of their previous desires and goals. Now, not all of them. I mean, dietary restrictions are the kind of thing that really do seem to co-vary with religious belief, but many of the central concerns of a person's life are going to remain in place. Right, like the desire for peace and cooperation, opposition to injustice, the pursuit of knowledge, those sorts of things tend to survive the loss of religious belief, even when they are previously conceived as being based on God's commands. So, maybe what this suggests is people's subjective concerns become tied up with particular beliefs. In religious communities, a person's subjective concerns may become tied up with their religion, and so they start to see their concerns as following from that religion. So like minor changes in religious belief lead to changes in subjective concern. But if there's a wholesale revolution, if you reject the religious framework entirely, then what happens is that this link that's forged between religious belief and subjective concern is severed. So many concerns remain in place despite the significant change of belief. And along the same lines, we might say, well, let's suppose that I'm not a nihilist. I believe that many things matter, and I take it that my subjective concerns tend to track what really matters. Well, with that sort of background belief in place, if I come to believe that animal welfare matters, I will then become concerned about animals. However, if I come to think that nihilism is true, if I come to think that nothing matters, we may expect that the link between evaluative belief and subjective concern will be severed. I won't lose all my subjective concerns. Instead, my subjective concerns will no longer be dependent on my evaluative beliefs. I mean, it's not difficult to come up with reasons why this sort of link between belief and concern can be severed. So consider again concerns based on God's commands. Note that the existence or non-existence of God and the content of God's commands makes no difference to my experience in my earthly life. Not now, nor in the future. I mean, at least assuming that God does not intervene. But, you know, so like being put in chains feels just as miserable regardless of whether God commands that slavery is acceptable or that slavery is wrong. So, you know, I mean, this is why a person, like if a person's opposed to slavery, and they take it that this is because God tells them it's wrong, well, actually, they can just continue being opposed to slavery even when they stop believing in God. Similarly, the truth or falsehood of nihilism makes no difference to my experience. When I put my hand on a hot stove, it hurts just as much, regardless of whether the pain really matters. When I see another person put their hand on a hot stove, I can feel just as much empathy for them, regardless of whether their pain really matters. So, you know, if I come to believe nihilism, I don't expect that any of these experiences are going to change. So we might think, okay, subjective concerns can just be like more direct attitudes to these experiences rather than being based on judgments about which experiences really matter. So that might be one reason to doubt that this covariance claim is going to hold when we consider a revolutionary change in belief like coming to endorse nihilism. Okay, another objection is that Kahane has failed to consider all of the relevant possibilities in stating his wager. So, what if things do matter? So nihilism is false, but and I believe that some things do matter, but I am wrong about what it is that matters. So things matter, I believe that things matter, but my evaluative beliefs are mostly false, they're off track. Well, in that case, acting on those beliefs is liable to do great harm. So consider again this third outcome where some things matter and I believe that some things matter. Kahane says, well, this is good, obviously. The assumption of the wager is that this is a really good outcome. But Kahane arguably, so the objection is, this overlooks that if my evaluative beliefs are completely off track, this option could be disastrous, in which case coming to hold the mistaken belief that nihilism is true could be a good thing. So consider, for instance, a person who believes that suffering and violence are good, brutality and bloodshed for all, somebody like the Marquis de Sade. Well, assuming that suffering is bad, surely it would be better if this person was to become a nihilist. So if some things matter, then it would be better to think that nothing matters than to think that the wrong things matter. Because if you think the wrong things matter, you're likely to do a lot of great harm. So the pragmatic argument doesn't go through. Now, Kahane does actually consider this objection, and he presents an extended payoff matrix. So this isn't quite the way he puts it, but I'm putting it like this. So consider now 5 possibilities. First 4 are the same, but now we have, well, not the same, rather. So for possibility number 3, we have some things matter, I believe that some things matter, and my beliefs are mostly true. And then we have this additional possibility, number 5, some things matter, I believe that some things matter, but my beliefs are mostly false. So, case 5. Things matter. I believe that things matter, but my evaluative beliefs are false. I could be doing great harm. I mean, if it turns out that the Marquis de Sade is right, and that suffering is actually good, then our efforts to reduce suffering are disastrous. It would be better for us to become nihilists and to stop caring about suffering. So this is the challenge. Now, Kahane, as I said, does consider this, and his response, as I understand it, goes like this. Recall that possibilities 1 and 2 are irrelevant because if nothing matters, it doesn't matter what we believe or what we do. Now, Kahane says that possibility number 5 is also irrelevant, but for a different reason. If our evaluative beliefs are completely off track, if we can have no confidence whatsoever in our judgments about what's good or bad, or about what we have reason to do, then deliberation would become pointless. If our evaluative beliefs are completely off track, we have no way to assess whether it would be good or bad for us to believe nihilism, whether it would be good or bad for us to have false evaluative beliefs, or anything else. Even attempting to answer the question of whether belief in nihilism is good or bad assumes that we are not in option 5. So as Kahane puts it, and I quote, "Since such skepticism would also make practical deliberation about these possibilities," that is, the possibilities outlined in the wager, since such skepticism would also make practical deliberation about these possibilities pointless, our very question assumes at least minimal confidence in our capacity to find out what matters. So that's supposed to be the response. I'm not sure this is convincing because, well, I mean, if our evaluative beliefs are completely off track, then of course, yeah, deliberation would be pointless. And it follows that deliberation about the possibilities set out in this wager would be pointless. But maybe deliberation is pointless, and maybe this wager is pointless. So the idea that our evaluative beliefs could be completely off track is, after all, explicitly intended to be an objection to the wager. It's rather puzzling to respond to that objection by saying that, well, if that objection is correct, then we can't state the wager in the first place. Like, if that objection is correct, the wager doesn't work. Well, yeah, of course. Of course it doesn't work. That's the point. So, yeah, I mean, that response I'm not so sure about. Kahane does also suggest that we can be reasonably confident that our evaluative beliefs are not totally off track. So maybe that would avoid the problem. But at least if you are open to the possibility, or at least if you are just skeptical about whether or not our evaluative beliefs are on track, then yes, it does seem that there might be a bit of a problem with stating this wager. Okay then, there's kind of a similar objection here, an objection along similar lines. So, we might think that nihilism can actually have various benefits, or rather, belief in nihilism can have various benefits. I actually realised that I have titled this section incorrectly. That should be the benefits of belief in nihilism. So, the idea is, some truths might be bad for us to know. Let's suppose that some things matter, and we believe that things matter, and our beliefs are mostly correct. But let's say that the evaluative facts are just really terrible. So our correct beliefs lead us to be pessimistic and hopeless. I mean, think of the work of people like David Benatar. Benatar argues that it would be better never to come into existence, that the quality of even the best human lives is fairly poor, that human beings are, they have, they are responsible, morally responsible for a great deal of suffering, etc. Now, if this is your view, then notice that, so on this kind of view, when people suffer, for instance, it's not just that they dislike the feeling, they're going to think it really is bad. So, if I'm suffering, and so let's say that, things matter, my evaluative beliefs are mostly true, but the pessimists are right. Well, then when I'm suffering, it's not just that I'm undergoing some bad feeling. It really is bad, and it really is worthless. It's probably not going to you know, there's no light at the end of the tunnel here. There's nothing to hope for. Life sucks, and it's probably going to continue sucking. And moreover, I can reasonably say that other people, human beings in general, are morally responsible for a lot of that suffering, right? Like, we are partly to blame for how bad the world is. So, you know, I reflect on the human condition, and I'm led to just despair and misanthropy. I have a couple of videos on pessimism and misanthropy, which I can link in the comments. So the thought is, well, you know, in this context, nihilism might be kind of liberating, right? Coming to believe that nothing matters might lift my mood, and it might actually give me the motivation to do what, you know, to do things that would have a positive impact. So, you know, instead of looking at the enormity of suffering with hopelessness and despair, I can say, you know, it doesn't really matter, because nothing really matters. But still, I dislike it. So I'm gonna work against it in my own corner of the world. And this might well be a better state of affairs. It might well be better. It might be objectively better for people to live with delusions that improve their well-being. And so, you know, I mean, if things matter, then most people are probably going to want to say that my well-being is one of the things that objectively matters, and it might well then be objectively better for me to believe nihilism. And indeed, it might even be that if I believe nihilism, I end up feeling like motivation. Instead of feeling hopelessness, I can kind of say, yeah, you know, nothing really matters, but there are some things that I dislike. So, you know, I'm still gonna work against them. Parfit says in On What Matters, I quote, "It is a difficult question whether and how it matters whether anything matters. If we believe that suffering matters greatly, we may regret this fact." So, you know, I mean, that's kind of the point, right? It's like, maybe the belief that nothing matters can make us feel better, and maybe feeling better is itself a good thing. So if we consider Kahane's wager with this in mind, well, okay, again, possibilities number 1 and 2 are irrelevant. Yeah, I mean, maybe I feel better for believing nihilism, but it doesn't matter that I feel better because nothing matters, right? So, on the other hand, possibility number 4, some things matter, but I believe that nothing matters, that might be good. Believing nihilism makes me happier with my own life, makes me look upon the rest of humanity with less negativity. David Benatar is not a nihilist in the sense that we are considering, but maybe he'd be happier if he were, and maybe that would be good for him. So, you know, that's another issue with the wager. Maybe believing nihilism can have good consequences too. Okay then, that is the end of that video. Hope you found that interesting. I will see you all next time. Goodbye, everybody.